Measuring the Congregation, Part 1. When you're a pastor going to a new congregation, it's important that you get a good perspective on the congregation and the people that you're supposed to be serving. Don't always trust what the pulpit committee says. They're trying to make the church look good. Talk to people who've known the church from the inside as well as from the outside. Check their references. Make sure that what they're presenting about the church really is what it seems to be. But before you begin that work, it's very important that you get the measure of the church that you're serving. Whether you've been a pastor you're a new pastor or been there for 10 years, you need to measure the congregation if you want to make sure that it grows. Gather hard data on your church. You need to be gathering empirical information. Get the attendance figures and chart them over 5 to 10 years. Look at Sunday school attendance. Look at the demographics of the community and see how your church compares to it. Memorize the history of the church and know all the key events that have happened. Later, you'll flesh out that history with stories and the unwritten history that people will tell you. You need all of this. If you understand where the church has been, you can understand where it needs to go. First of all, get attendance and participation numbers. Many churches don't keep long-term attendance figures, but they're very important to assessing growth. Without attendance figures, our estimates are usually inaccurate. Pay attention to 3 particular figures. First of all, pay attention to 3 important figures. First of all, the percentage of attendees compared to the number of members. This gives you an indication of the level of commitment people have to church and programs. Also, the average giving per person. This will let you see the level of commitment that they have. Also, look at the number of people who are involved in ministry or small groups outside of the morning worship service. This will help you see something of the spiritual health of the membership. Now, one caution about figures. Don't look for 100% participation in tithing or in small groups or any of these things. You don't want 100% participation. First of all, you'll never see it. Second, it doesn't account for people who can't participate due to sickness or extenuating circumstances. You need those people in the church too. We can only accomplish this the only way you can accomplish 100% is to exclude people with problems. People who are marginally committed also people who are marginally committed are our mission field in the church. If everyone is already healthy, there's no need for evangelism within the church. And that means no growth within the church. If half your people are attending, you are usually doing well. That means you have another half to help grow into deeper discipleship. Let's look at an example. We'll call this church First Church. You notice the morning attendance in this is 500, but it's down by 8%. Evening worship attendance, it was 100, but it's down by 2%. Small groups are down by 1%. Per capita giving is actually up by 2%. Over 5 years. The percentage of tithers is also up by 18%, and the average time as members in the church has gone from 3 years to 10 years. Now, what do these figures tell us? Well, first of all, it tells us that the area where attendance is declining is among people who are marginally committed. Although the church remains strong internally, it's not fulfilling the Great Commission by reaching people who are marginally committed. They're leaving. In time, the older members will die off, and you'll see those numbers of per capita giving, etc., go down. But what it shows us is that the people who are already committed are staying around, but the new people are not. This is a church that needs revitalization. It needs to be able to reach out to the community it's in better. All right, another helpful tool is to look at the demographics of the church and compare them with the community in which the church exists. Now, what is culture? Well, culture in Greek is the word ethnos, and ethnos means really anything. It can mean racial, economic, political, national, or political divisions. A culture is all of these things above. It can be an ideological group or it can be a racial group. It's whatever the surrounding environment is. Now, when you look at a church, you need to look at Now, some of the things you need to measure if you're going to determine the culture of a church and community are racial and ethnic mix, the average age of the community, the median income of the community, the educational levels that are in the community, the average time in the community, is it made up of newcomers or old-timers? Also, the numbers of people in a household. Are there 2 per household or 3 per household? That tells you how many families you have. These are things you need to look at. You need to look at them both in the church and outside of the church. So let's give an example for comparison. At First Church, we see within the First Church that the racial and ethnic mix is 80% black, 13% Hispanic, and 7% white. Whereas in the community, that is within a 3-mile radius of the church, it is 5% black, 6% Hispanic, and 89% white. We see the average age at First Church is 54, whereas in the community, the average age is 33. We see the educational level within First Church is high school, but in the neighboring community is a postgraduate is expected. The length of stay for people within First Church in the community is 30 years, but in the community it's 3 years. That means a lot of new people have moved into the community. Household numbers are different. At First Church, the average size is 2. In community, the average size of a household is 5. The political affiliation within the First Church is Democrat, whereas the political affiliation predominantly in the community is Republican. Now, what does this tell us about the church? Well, for one thing, it tells us that we have a very different cultural, racial, and educational level within the church and without the church. This indicates that this church is going to have a very hard time being able to reach out into its community. It needs to either make some changes within the church to accommodate new ethnic groups, or it needs to relocate to a community that is more like itself. Another thing you look at when you look at a community is the commitment to the cultural traditions of the community. Just because people might be, say, black or white or Hispanic doesn't mean necessarily that that's the thing that defines them. So we can look at different groups within any cultural mix and we can see that they're different. Some people are outer culture people. Those are people who are sort of marginally committed to the cultural tradition of which they are in. There are also people that are middle cultural. That means that they have a higher level of commitment to whatever it is they are, whether it be black or white or Hispanic. But they're open to other people and new ideas. Then there are the inner culture. These are the people who not only are thoroughly committed to their cultural tradition, but are resistant to anything outside of their cultural tradition. These are people who really need to be reached within that culture. So you have outer, middle, and inner cultural commitments. But in addition to that, you also have people who are moving into that cultural community. Maybe they're not weren't born in it, but they're attracted to it and they want to be part of that cultural tradition. There are also people who are born in that cultural tradition that are moving out. Many times in churches where they have a few people of differing races in their church, you find that many of the people that are in that may be from one cultural tradition, but they're trying to resist and have been resisting the cultural tradition in which they grew up. Those are the people who usually first move to a church outside of that cultural tradition. But it's very difficult for them to attract people who are also of that cultural tradition. So let's give all this an example to help you understand. Now, let's take, for example, a church that is a Southern white cultural tradition church. What you're going to find in that is something like this. Within that inner cultural tradition, you're going to find people who grew up in the rural South, who like country music, who met their wife at a tractor pull or some other thing that was a cultural event, who drive pickups, whose favorite food is grits. Now, in that middle cultural tradition, the middle culture people, you're going to find maybe they grew up in the suburbs but consider themselves Southern white. They like country music, but they also like rock music. Met their wife at college, drive a Ford, not a pickup. and their favorite foods is grits, but they also like pizza. The outer cultural tradition may be people who grew up in the city and traveled a lot, but were considered themselves cultural, Southern culture, who like country music, but they also like urban hip-hop and smooth jazz, who maybe has an African-American wife, who drives a Prius and not a Ford or a pickup, whose favorite food might be sushi, and yet they consider themselves to be Southern white. You also find people who are moving into that tradition. That would be somebody who, for example, might have been born in Pakistan, who likes the rural South, who met his wife at church, who's learning to like Johnny Cash, who drives a pickup, and is learning to like grits, although he still prefers some of the Pakistani dishes. People who are moving out of that tradition might have been born in the rural South, hate country music, might be gay, and doesn't drive, and hates grits. Now, it would be easy to look at somebody who grew up in the South and say, well, they fit in the Southern culture, but they may not do that at all. Now, when you're planning a church, you've got to decide, which cultural group do most of our people live in? If most of our people might be African American, but they're really in the outer culture of that, they're really running away from being African American, it's going to be very hard for them to attract people of African American descent, even though they may be them. So it's very important to understand the demographics of the particular church that you are in. The more differences that exist between the culture of the church and the culture of the community, the more difficult it will be for us to cross that gap and get people to come to church. Even so, we can overcome those gaps and cross them in 3 ways. First of all, by prayer and genuine love. We do not have to be like somebody to love them, and love overcomes the barriers. Secondly, by encouraging cultural differences within the church. We must preach and act in ways that welcome differences, not exclude them. We must tell people that not everybody has to be alike or like us, that people can be different. Third, by focusing on what we have in common and not what sets us apart. We must be aware of differences. We must be aware of them, but we must celebrate the unity that we have in Christ. Christ made from all the people of the earth one people, a new race, a new nationality, and a new culture. And we need to celebrate that culture, not the old ones from which we came.